I'm Sadie Whitaker. I was 29, working 2 jobs in downtown Chicago. And the morning my grandmother finally spoke. I was sitting beside her in a small bank conference room. My Uncle Russell had spread the papers neatly, slid a pen across polished wood, and smiled like this was routine. Like all he needed was one shaky signature. In my coat pocket, I had 12 months of photocopied statements showing the same $800 deposit landing every month. And until that hour, I still had no idea who sent it. My grandmother, Evelyn Keating, had not said a word in front of my family for almost a year. Not in hospitals. Not in my apartment. Not through a single visit built around paperwork. Russell leaned toward her and murmured, "It's simple. Mother, just authorize the transfer." And even then he sounded less worried about her than the clock. The compliance officer watched her hands. Caleb stood near the door without moving, and I could hear my own pulse over the hush Russell had mistaken for surrender. Then my grandmother lifted her chin, looked straight at the pen, and said, "I understand exactly what he wants. And the answer is no." And the whole room changed shape. Russell went pale so fast it looked painful, because the story he had been telling depended on her silence and mine. What collapsed first was not his plan for the account, but the version of me my family had carried for years, useful, tired, and easy to move aside. By then, my life had already narrowed into the kind of routine people call manageable when they are not the ones living inside it every single day. I worked mornings doing medical billing at a physical therapy office, then covered night audit shifts at a boutique hotel where tired businessmen complained about room keys like I controlled gravity. I rented a studio near the Brown Line, the kind of place where the radiator knocked at 4 in the morning and the window frame leaked cold straight through winter. My brother Grant had grown up in the brighter version of our family, the version with applause, extra chances, and the quiet assumption that investment in him would always pay off. When he changed majors twice, my mother called it finding himself. But when I left school after one unpaid hospital bill too many, she looked at me and used one word: practical. She said it the way some people say, manageable. Like I had become a smaller life everyone could tolerate because it required less imagination from them. I had been the daughter who could cover a shift, skip a semester, move apartments in one afternoon, and keep smiling through dinners where nobody asked follow-up questions. My father, Thomas Rowe, liked peace more than truth. So whenever my mother, Diane, started dividing futures at the table, he reached for his water glass and studied condensation. That was how a family teaches you your role without ever saying it plainly. By funding one child's momentum and training the other one to absorb impact. So by the time my grandmother ended up in my care, nobody in that room had really chosen me as much as calculated that I would bend. They knew I lived small, worked hard, and rarely asked for rescue, which made me useful in exactly the way neglected daughters often become useful. I was not the first choice for anything good in that family, but I was always the backup plan when something expensive fell apart. I did not find out my grandmother had lost the brownstone because anyone in my family thought I deserved honesty. I found out because nobody noticed I was standing nearby. It was Thanksgiving. The kitchen smelled like burnt rolls and wet coats, and my Uncle Russell was telling my father the sale had already closed. He called it a smart repositioning of assets, said the new development outside Milwaukee would triple her money, and spoke like certainty could erase every missing detail. The brownstone had been the last solid thing in my grandmother's life. 3 narrow floors in Old Town with a tiny garden and a front stoop, worn smooth by decades. My grandfather bought it before I was born, paid it off before he died, and my grandmother treated that house like proof a life could hold. By spring, Russell's sure thing had folded under financing delays, zoning problems, and legal costs. And the house that held her history was gone for good. What replaced it was a 1-bedroom rental on the far north side. Clean enough, quiet enough, and stripped of nearly everything I remembered from her old life. The framed photographs were missing. The dining table was gone, and even the lamp near her reading chair had disappeared as if somebody had cleared memory room by room. My mother stopped mentioning visits once the house was gone, which told me more than any family explanation ever could about what had mattered. I went to see my grandmother one Saturday without telling anyone, carrying a bakery box and the strange guilt that comes with doing something decent in secret. She looked smaller in that apartment. Not confused. Not broken. Just reduced by rooms that no longer belonged to her. And I hated Russell for that immediately. We ate pastries by the window, talked about weather and tea, and when I got up to leave, she touched my wrist and murmured, "You were always the kind one," which stayed with me long after the elevator doors closed. My grandmother's stroke entered the family the same way everything serious did, already filtered through inconvenience, already translated into logistics before anyone admitted what had actually happened. A Meals on Wheels driver found her on the floor. The hospital stabilized her, and my mother waited 3 days before calling me with, "The practical issue now is long-term care." When I got to the hospital, my mother, my father, Russell, and my brother Grant were in the hallway discussing facilities, costs, Medicaid, and distance with the flat concentration people use over damaged property. I heard myself cut across them with, "I can take her for a while," and the silence that followed was not gratitude. Only the quick, private math of people realizing someone else had volunteered. 3 weeks later, Russell pulled up outside my building with my grandmother in the passenger seat, 2 suitcases in the trunk, and the kind of hurry that makes abandonment look procedural. He handed me a list of medications, mentioned tea with 2 sugars, called it temporary, and drove off before the curb had stopped shaking under the tires. I carried the suitcases upstairs, pushed my bed against the wall, bought an inflatable mattress for the window side of the studio, and learned how little space a whole life is allowed once a family decides it has become inconvenient. At night, I worked hotel audit shifts. In the mornings, I billed insurance claims. And in the hours between, I learned how to help her stand, bathe, swallow pills, and sit through the angry humiliation of needing help. She never spoke. Not once. But silence was not the same thing as absence. And I knew the difference because I was there for all of it. She followed the evening news with narrowed eyes, tapped twice when she wanted water, pressed once against my wrist when she was tired, and rolled her eyes at the television when politicians started lying. My mother called only to ask about forms, records, and whether I had found any old documents among my grandmother's things, which told me exactly where her concern began and ended. By then I understood that caretaking without witnesses changes the person doing it, because every small act becomes proof of love when nobody watching plans to reward it. My family returned the way people return to a property dispute, not with casseroles or remorse, but with timing, paperwork, and sudden concern about what was legally appropriate. My mother called first, using that polished administrative tone she wore when she wanted compliance, and told me the family was discussing better long-term options. When I asked what had changed after months of silence, she paused, just long enough to admit Russell needed to speak with my grandmother about an old account. A week later, Grant came to the hotel lobby near the end of my shift, dressed like his life was still intact and carrying the careful humility of a man who needed something expensive. He told me he was sorry, told me he had been selfish, told me I looked exhausted, then lowered his voice and added, "If there's money somewhere, it should go to Grandma's care." Nothing in his face moved when he said that, and the stillness bothered me more than anger would have, because it felt like watching somebody perform sincerity for a locked door. The letters started arriving 3 days after that. Thick envelopes from a lawyer asking medication logs, treatment notes, and proof my apartment was suitable for someone medically fragile. I spread them across my table beside pill bottles, appointment cards, and physical therapy instructions, and for the first time understood that bureaucracy could be used like pressure applied with clean hands. Caleb read every page, helped me organize copies, and muttered, "They don't need this much unless they're building toward something," which was exactly what I had already begun to fear. Russell set the bank meeting for a Tuesday afternoon, calling it a routine verification of authority, and by then I had learned that routine was his favorite disguise for theft. I brought my grandmother. Caleb came with us, and in the conference room, Russell pushed the forms forward and murmured, "Grant is in real trouble. Mother, and this is family money." My grandmother looked at the papers, then at Russell, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out worn but precise. "I understand exactly what he wants. And the answer is no." Russell froze first. Then Grant's whole polished image cracked around the eyes, because neither of them had built a plan for a woman who could still decide. My grandmother kept going, told the compliance officer she had been speaking for months, told him she had stayed quiet on purpose, and told Russell he would never touch another account of hers again. Then she turned to me, and before anyone else in that room could recover, she revealed that the $800 had been coming from her all along and that the rest had already been transferred, legally and carefully, into my name. The family dinner happened 2 weeks after the bank, at a restaurant my mother chose because neutral territory always made her feel less responsible for what she was asking. My grandmother walked in on her own, slower than before, but steady, and the look on Russell's face told me he had expected weakness to return by dessert. Grant was already seated with his hands folded too neatly, my father staring at the table, my mother wearing the expression she used when she wanted forgiveness without having to name the damage. My grandmother did not raise her voice, which made every word land harder when she turned to Russell and reminded him he had sold her home on confidence alone. Then she faced my mother and asked why weekly visits had stopped the minute the brownstone was gone. And my mother's mouth opened on. Things got complicated. Before the excuse even sounded convincing. My father never offered one, just kept turning his water glass in place. And that small, helpless motion angered me more than shouting would have. Grant tried last, leaning forward with the same careful softness he had brought to my hotel lobby, and hearing it twice made the performance easier to recognize. He started with, "I was trying to fix things," and my grandmother cut through him with a calm that left nowhere to hide. Because using better manners to reach into someone else's pocket is still reaching. I watched his face harden for 1 second when he realized gentleness was no longer working. And that single crack told the truth more clearly than the apology ever had. When my mother looked at me and asked whether we could please stop doing this in public, I understood she still thought embarrassment was the real injury. I stood, helped my grandmother with her coat, and told her, "Family is not complicated. It just gets called complicated when people want distance from the choices they made." Then Caleb rose beside us, and the three of us walked out before anyone at that table could mistake silence for consent again. Grant was indicted on federal securities fraud charges within months. Russell cooperated to save himself, and neither man looked impressive once records replaced family mythology. My mother and father were not charged, but the distance they had built for years finally became visible, fixed, and too honest to rename. I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment with real light and a window seat for my grandmother, and Caleb carried the box marked photographs. When I brought tea to the bedroom, she touched the sill, looked out at the street, and told me, "This one feels like ours." That was enough for me, because after years being the backup plan, I had a home where nobody was waiting to leave. Thank you for staying with me through this story and the quiet kind of survival that rarely looks brave while you are living it. If something here felt familiar, stay close. Because healing can begin in smaller rooms than we expect and still lead somewhere gentle. Come back.